Want to welcome everybody back to our study of the book of James. We're going to be picking back up in James chapter 3. Kaylin and I are hanging out at the beach trying to get some R&R, but just kind of wanted to get some thoughts in on James chapter 3 and kind of keep us up in our study. So let's just go ahead and start with our reading of James chapter 3 in verses 1 through 12. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. If we put bits in the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. It's a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed, and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth these things ought not be so. Does a spring bring forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Well, I'm reminded of this story of this man who worked in a grocery store, middle-aged man. He was a checker, and this lady came up to him and said, I want to buy half a head of lettuce. And he's like, I'm sorry, we don't sell half heads of lettuce. To which she said, I want to buy half a head of lettuce. And he said, I'm sorry, we don't sell a half head of lettuce. Well, she was undone by this. She was like, I just want to talk to your manager. And he said, you know what? Let me do this. I'm going to go talk to my manager and see what he says, okay? And so he goes up to his manager, catches his manager, and says, you're not going to believe this, but I have got this lame brain lady who wants to buy a half a head of lettuce. Well, the whole time his boss is like saying, stop. I've got, because this lady, he could see this lady is coming right up behind him, and obviously didn't want, her to hear what he was saying. So he's trying to stop his employee, and the guy picked up on it, on what his boss was saying, and he whirled around and said, oh, and this lovely lady right here is wanting to buy the other half of this head of lettuce. So the boss was really impressed with his quick wit, his quick-mindedness, and started chatting it up with him and said, hey, that was real quick of you. And he says, well, I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. We are known for three things: our quick-mindedness and quick wit, ugly women, and great hockey teams. To which his boss said, oh, really? He says, well, my wife is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he says, oh, really? Well, what hockey team does she play for? Some people are really quick on their feet, but no matter how quick you are on your feet, there's going to come a time when your tongue gets the best of you. And frankly, it'll bring out the worst in you. Maybe that's why it resonates so much with this line that says, the greatest way to save face is to keep the lower part of it shut. And the Bible has a lot to say about the tongue in the lower part of your face, particularly in the book of James. And in this section that we're reading about, a faith that works, which again, theme of our study, right, in the book of James, we see that in James chapter 3. To me, the most compelling part of this image is likening the tongue to a fire. Maybe you've watched a movie sometime where somebody said, "Fire in the hole." Well, we have a fire in our hole. We all do, don't we? And it's explosive, and it's worth noting that James has something to say to these churches about the tongue. In fact, if you stop and look at it, every single chapter in the book of James has something to say about the tongue. The tongue can be used for good purposes. Let's just look at some of those passages that talk about this in the book of James. The tongue can be used to ask for wisdom, James chapter 1 and verse 5. To affirm God's will, James chapter 4 and verse 15. To pray and praise, James chapter 5 verse 13. To call on the elders for healing and prayer, James chapter 5 verse 14. And to confess sins, James chapter 5 and verse 16. On the flip side, the tongue can be used for very destructive purposes as well. To blaspheme God, James chapter 1 verse 13. To show favoritism, James chapter 2 verse 3. To fake concern, James chapter 2 verse 16. To quarrel, James 4 verse 1. To slander, James 4 verse 11. To brag and boast, James chapter 4 and verse 16. To grumble, James chapter 5 verse 9. To swear, James chapter 5 and verse 12. Well, evidently it was interesting having to deal with these churches that James is writing to, and frankly to all of us most probably as well. And maybe this is the reason why James opens up and says, not many of you should be teachers. Maybe he's saying that the more that one speaks, the more one has an opportunity to stumble as well. And when you see the power of the tongue, you can certainly see why Jesus is telling them, or why James is telling them, don't rush in to being an influencer in the church or a leader. It's interesting really to see how much respect James gives the tongue in this letter. It's a teacher's primary tool is the use of the tongue. But when you recognize how difficult it is to control in our own lives, you realize that your primary asset can also become your primary liability. Again, it's interesting to see how much respect he gives the tongue. If anyone is never at fault in what they say, well, that's a perfect person. So why in the world does James say it in this way? And what I think James is saying is that the tongue is so difficult to control that if you can master that, well, then you can master every other part of your body as well in your life. He's saying to, I believe, show me a person who is never at fault in anything that they say, and I'll show you a perfect person. But we all know that we're not perfect in the things that we say, right? Because the tongue is a restless thing. And by the way, have you ever noticed that in overcoming any kind of sin in our life or destructive habit in our life, that we also have to overcome the tongue? If you've ever struggled with an addiction in your life, you know that there are times where you have to keep covering up that addiction in your life, the thing that you're in bondage to. And so a lot of times it's not just the addiction that we have to break, but also the rhythm that we get into of covering up and lying that has to be broken. Does that make sense? So James is saying, well, that's why the tongue is so powerful, in because not only am I having to deal with this destructive pattern in my life, but I'm also having to deal, with this issue of the tongue. So James says to you that that this is a big deal. In effect, the power of the tongue. Well, I want to break down this passage in a few ways here. The first section we're going to deal with is James chapter 3 and verses 3 through 5. And I think here what James is saying is that the tongue has a profound leverage in our life. And he uses these word pictures here to demonstrate this, or to illustrate this. You put a bit in the mouth of a horse, and that can direct the entire horse, right? You can control the whole horse with that bit. Also consider the rudder on a ship. That's another picture or illustration here. A small rudder can dictate the entire destiny of a ship, an entire ship. Now think about that for a second in your own life as well. I think about it just with respect to me. My entire life changed based on a vow that I made with Kaylin, my wife. When I made that vow to her, it affected my relationship with other men as well as with other women as well. From that point on, it's impacted my decisions in my life about when I work, about where I work, where I live, what I purchase. There's really no decision that I make in my life that I don't have to consider Kaylin because of that vow that I made to her. Now, my life is lived in light of that vow that I made to Kaylin in those words. Not even when my life is lived in light of this vow, it has leverage on there because of the consequences associated with not living in light of it, right? The consequences can be emotional, they can be spiritual, and they can be relational, and they can be social as well. The fact of the matter is, I can't take that vow back. I made that vow to her. It has leverage in my life, and it's a game changer in my life. I'm forced to live with that vow that I made to her. So how many of us in your life have you ever lied? Let's show of hands, right? Well, guess what? Sometimes we have to do. We have to cover it up, right? And sometimes you'll see people who spend their entire life and energy trying to keep up with what they've said to different people and to who. And these narratives, you have to keep those up as well. Well, eventually one of two things happen. Eventually you'll either get flushed out or you will crash and burn, because your tongue dictates how you spend your energy and your rhythms in your life. Have you ever have you ever said something to someone and they're not going to let you forget it? Now, that's their problem too, right? That's their sin too as well. But we've all had our share of beds that we've had to lie in. Oftentimes, relationships, they revolve around overstatements or off-the-cuff remarks that you can make. And sometimes people just can't forget us, saying those things. And that is the power of the tongue. In many cases, I'm living with the fruit of my lips. And what I say can either provide future blessing or it can produce bondage in my own life. And I think that's what James is saying in James 3 and verse 5. Boasting isn't necessarily arrogance, but it's talking about the fact that it can legitimately boast about the fact that the tongue has leverage on my destiny of whether I reap bondage or whether I reap blessings. It's tied to what I sow with my mouth. So there are two more word pictures as well. that illustrate this. They're very negative word pictures he's trying to show the destructive reach or the power of the tongue, and he does this kind of in a curious way. He says in verse 5 that it's set on fire by hell itself. In verse 6, he says that it's a restless evil. So he's trying to get us to see here in this passage the relationship between our tongue and hell or evil. My tongue can be closely tied to the work of the enemy. And when you think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense. How did the devil cause Adam and Eve to stumble? It wasn't with some saber that he came in waving, at them. Rather, he lied to them. He used words. Words are the most destructive kinds of weapons. I think about John chapter 8 and verse 44. Jesus, speaking of the devil, says, when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So when Satan speaks, we need to understand that his native language is lying. So it is, I don't know if it's ever occurred to you before or not. Has it ever occurred to you that lying and deceit are actually the language of Satan? So what am I saying? I guess all of us at some point in time in our life are bilingual, whether we intended to be or not. You may have only thought you only spoke one language, but there's the language of our origin, and then there's the enemy's language as well. So you think about it too in this way. God spoke the world into existence. So how does Satan try to destroy it? Well, with the spoken word. So this is really huge stuff here that James is trying to emphasize to us. Now, Satan may not be, let's rephrase it this way. Satan may be God's adversary, but he's certainly not his equal. And that's why God's word triumphs in the end. But the most often condemned sins in the New Testament are what? Adultery? Not so much. Murder? Not so much. Rather, they're the sins of the tongue. Because these are the sins that are the oldest in the book. They're the oldest sins in the Bible. And so we all have to be wary at times in our life of being verbal arsonists, right? We've seen it in schools, we've seen it in our homes, we've seen it in church. We've all been burned by the tongue in our own lives, and we all smell the smoke, right? So if we're going to move from this, though, we need some help. We need some genuine help along the way. Because, James says, we've had all these animals that we've tamed in our life, but the one thing that we haven't been able to tame is the tongue itself. So we can't do it by ourselves. And he says this some 2,000 years ago. We've tamed even back then, it tamed a lot of things, but had not been able to tame the tongue. Same thing is actually true today. Well, why is that so? The reason is because we're up against a power that is more powerful than ourselves individually. And this is why we need help. We need help with this from the Lord. And this is where James says, well, have you met my half-brother Jesus? Because he can help us out with that. Well, we'll pick up with that next time in our lesson. And I hope you're enjoying this series, okay? Thanks a lot.